Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Learning Objective on Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones. I'm not going to talk too much on this. We're going to be watching a song on her. We'll be listening and watching a little video vignette about her life story, and then we'll be watching an actress named Betsy Means give a speech that she delivered in defense of children who were working in textile factories. Mother Harris Jones was a labor organizer. She was incredibly radical in her approach to organizing labor. The things that she was fighting against in general was the human cost of the Industrial Revolution. She was fighting against the social norms of social Darwinism and big business and class warfare. Her story is disturbingly relevant. She championed mainly minor workers, but she also was an advocate, a strong advocate for child labor, or at least not for child labor, but against the practice of child labor. We're still seeing this played out, not so much in this country, although it still exists, but just recently the fire in Bangladesh that killed over 1,000 people demonstrates the dynamic that still exists within our economy. That's just been exported out of our borders, generally speaking. So these things still exist with us. They just are, for the most part, hidden from our view. But millions of people lived through the things that she was working against and trying to stop. Just to give you a sense of who this person was, she was definitely fearless. She was a little old lady, maybe 5 feet, but not someone to reckon with. And a lot of people were disarmed by just her appearance, and coupled with her determination not to back down from any fight that might have been presented to her. Just to share you something from her autobiography, she was going to organize in Colorado when the governor had her taken off the train and put on a different train out of the state. And so she was on that train being taken out of the state, and the conductor knew she was on the train, and the conductor was sympathetic to her and what she was doing. So on the next stop, the conductor took her off of the train and put her back on a train that was headed back to Colorado, where she was able to organize successfully. This is the letter she wrote to the governor in response to his actions of trying to exile her from Colorado. Mr. Governor, you notified your dogs of war to put me out of the state. They compiled with your instructions. I hold in my hands a letter that was handed to me by one of them, which says, under no circumstances return to this state. I wish to notify you, Governor, that you do not own the state. When it was admitted to the Sisterhood of States, my father gave me a share of stock in it. And that's all that he gave to you. The civil courts are open. If I break a law of state or nation, it is the duty of the civil courts to deal with me. That is why my forefathers established those courts, to keep dictators and tyrants such as you from interfering with civilians. I am right here in the Capitol after being out 9 or 10 hours, 4 or 5 blocks from your office. I want to ask you, Governor, what in the hell are you going to do about it? And with that, I'm going to let Utah Phillips and Betsy Means tell you a little bit about the great Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones, an American heroine.
I was traveling through Illinois when I was invited to stop and sing at a memorial there in the little town of Mount Olive. Now, who of note in American history is buried in the cemetery in Mount Olive, Illinois? I'll give you a hint. It was a woman. It was the Union Miners Cemetery. Do you have it yet? Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones. His hard for the mind to encompass a life that embraced the presidencies between Andrew Jackson and Herbert Hoover. Why, when Mother Jones was a little girl, there were people still alive who remembered the Revolutionary War. And she died on the eve of the New Deal. Her millinery shop burned down in the Chicago fire, and she had heard Abraham Lincoln speak in person. Mostly, though, Mother Jones was the miner's friend. Down in Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia. Well, the men would be organizing the underground workers, the miners. Mother Jones had already organized their wives and led them over the snow-covered game trails down into the hollows, where, armed with mops and brooms, they drove the scabs out of the coal pits. Now, Mother Jones wasn't an organizer, she was an agitator, which meant often enough she was hated as much by the organizers as by the bosses. One time, Mother Jones was out in Colorado at the great Ludlow strike. Now, that was a strike to enforce the 8-hour day, which the state of Colorado had made a law, but they couldn't enforce it because Rockefeller owned the militia. Now, the governor promised not to send the militia into the coal fields, but he lied, and he did. Mother Jones was in the Union Hall down there at Ludlow, and word came that the militia had entered the coal fields. Well, she leapt up, and she screamed, "Let's go get the sons of bitches!" And she stormed out. She didn't look to see if anybody was following her. Nobody was following her. She just flounced up the road alone and confronted the militia. And that was the year that President Theodore Roosevelt called Mother Jones the most dangerous woman in America. And she was 83 years old. That's some kind of dangerous.
Most dangerous woman. 83 years old. The most dangerous woman. Mother Jones.
100 years ago today, labor organizer Mother Jones marched on the summer home of President Teddy Roosevelt on Long Island. By her side, children, mill workers. She was protesting the plight of child laborers. Mother Jones' march had begun 3 weeks earlier in Philadelphia, where she witnessed 10,000 children working in textile mills for close to no pay. Well, this year, actress Betsy Means chose to commemorate the March of the Mill Children by retracing the steps of Mother Jones. For the past 3 weeks, she's been marching, often dressed as Mother Jones, from Philadelphia, heading towards Long Island, in events sponsored by various chapters of the AFL-CIO. Today, she arrives at Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay. She'll be performing as Mother Jones in the town, but not at Roosevelt's former residence. Officials there, which is now a museum, brushed Means off very much like Mother Jones was brushed off 100 years ago. When she arrived on this day in 1903, the president's secretary told her the president was, quote, unavailable. 100 years later, officials at the museum rejected Means' offer to perform. A museum spokesperson recently told the newspaper Newsday, this is one of those minor footnotes in history. But neither the march nor the life of Mother Jones can be considered a footnote in American history. The march brought Mother Jones national attention. Within 3 years, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York passed the nation's first child labor laws. We turn now to Betsy Means, who joined us recently in our studio as Mother Jones.
When I look into the faces of the helpless children and see their appealing eyes, it touches the tender chords of a mother's heart. I stand before you today on behalf of the helpless children. Organized labor and humanity demand protection for these helpless victims of insatiable greed. I have seen your children murdered. Murdered. You are living in America. America, where Patrick Henry and Jefferson lived, those heroes of days gone by. The day of child slavery has got to end. On May 29th of this year, in the spring of this year in Kensington, Pennsylvania, 75,000 textile workers went on strike. Of this number, at least 10,000 were little children. They were striking for shorter hours. They wanted their work week reduced from 60 hours a week to 55 hours a week. Every day at union headquarters, little children came in, Some with their hands off, some with a thumb missing, some with their fingers off at the knuckles. They're stooped little things, round-shouldered and skinny. Many of them were not over 10 years of age, although the law prohibits their working before they are 12 years of age. Or the law is poorly enforced. And the mothers of these children often swear falsely as to the ages of their children. In a single block in Kensington, 14 women, the mothers of 21 children, said it was a question of starvation or perjury, that the fathers had been killed or maimed at the mines. I asked the newspaper reporters why they didn't report the facts about child labour in Pennsylvania. They said they couldn't, because the mill owners had stock in the papers. Is that a fact? But I have stock in these children, I said, and I arranged for a little publicity. We assembled a number of girls and boys one morning in Independence Park. And from there we arranged to parade with banners to the courthouse, where I held a great meeting. A great crowd had gathered in the public square in front of City Hall. I put the little boys with their hands off and their fingers crushed and maimed up on the platforms beside me. And I held up their mutilated hands and I showed them to the crowd. Philadelphia's mansions are built on the broken bones and quivering hearts of these children. Their little lives go out to make wealth for others. Neither state nor city officials pay any attention to these wrongs. They do not care that these children are to be the future citizens of our nation. The city officials were standing in the open windows opposite. I held up the little ones of the mill high above the heads of the crowd and pointed to their puny arms and legs and hollow chests. You're a light to lift. I call upon you millionaire manufacturers to cease your moral murders. And I cried to the city officials in the open windows opposite. Someday, the workers will take possession of your city hall. And when we do, no child will be sacrificed on the altar of profit. The officials, they quickly closed their windows, just as they had closed their eyes and hearts. The Philadelphia papers and the New York papers quoted my statement about Philadelphia's mansions being built on the broken bones and quivering hearts of children. Philadelphia papers and the New York papers, they got into a squabble with each other over the question. Universities discussed it. Preachers began talking. That was what I wanted. Public attention on the subject of child labour. Fellow toilers, we have gathered here today for a purpose. Every movement made in the history of civilization has an underlying purpose. You have reached the century in human civilization when the charge of human slavery must forever disappear. I rise to ask the American people, am I my children's keeper? If we could raise up humanity to obviate all strife, what a glorious world this would be. But constituted as it is, society inflicts many hardships on those least able to bear them. We must work for peace and goodwill to all mankind. Children yet unborn, arise and bless you. Take the children out of the mills and mines and sweatshops. Allow them to develop their bodies and minds and souls. These children are to be the future citizens of America. Yes, pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mother Jones, 100 years ago this week, she led the March of the Mill Children from Philadelphia to right here in New York, ending up in Sagamore Hill at Teddy Roosevelt's home in Oyster Bay, though he did not come out to greet them.
Oh, that's right, he didn't.
Can you talk about why you have decided to play Mother Jones? Betsy Means is the actor who is here with us today.
Well, I'll have to break out of character for that now, won't I? I'm going to take off my glasses as a tribute to Mother Jones, and I'll use my regular accent, my Chicago accent. 2 years ago, I found Mother Jones, not just knowing the name of the magazine or that she was associated with labor. And I went back and did research on her, and on a very personal level, I had a deep, profound respect for the courage that she had. She saw tremendous suffering. I mean, how many of us just go, you know, who wants to really, really look at that? I mean, there's so much happening in the world today, and who really wants to take that into their heart and mind and soul? And Mother Jones was able to not only go down into the Georgian cotton mills, into the southern cotton mills, go into these factories that were essentially run by children. Look at these children running barefooted up and down the spindles, working day and night in the factory from 6 in the evening till 6 in the morning for 10 cents a night, being just ground out for profit. It's very painful material, and I just respected her tremendously for having the courage to do that.
Can you talk about Mother Jones' history?
Yes, Mother Jones, she was acquainted with grief, as other great teachers that we have known. And she was born in Cork, Ireland. Her grandfather was hanged by the British soldiers. Her father had to flee Ireland. Police came into her home when she was 5, tore down her chimney looking for her father. She saw tremendous suffering in Ireland of the working poor. She came over, her father had come over to the United States. She came over in Memphis, Tennessee, when she was an adult. In 1867, her husband and 4 children, they were living in the pinch gut section of Memphis, the poor section, obviously, the hungry section, the pinch gut section. And a yellow fever epidemic swept through Memphis. And in 1 week, her husband and 4 children died of yellow fever. Her whole family died. And then she went up to Chicago, opened a dressmaking establishment. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire burnt down everything she had. So then she started going into the burned down churches and listening to these tremendous speakers from the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor had been formed just after the Civil War, after chattel slavery had ended, industrial slavery was beginning, or not beginning, but really, really coming into its own as surges of immigrants came over from the old world. And she got radicalized, she got educated. And at this point, she really felt that God had saved her for a purpose. And so she went after that. She had no money. She wore the clothes on her back. She went wherever there was a fight. She did this march when she was 73 years old. She went to Colorado after that, was thrown in prison illegally in her 70s, had guns forced into her face by the Pinkerton boys.
And this was over mining.
This was over mining. Her main work, actually, I chose for my piece to focus on this March of the Mill Children. It was very concise. It was an hour long, but her real work was with the miners of the United States of America. And she went in, and these miners were down in the coal mines for 14 hours a day, dying like flies, uneducated, never seeing she describes gorgeously the color of the eyes of their children. I mean, they were just being, again, ground out and dying of horrible, hideous diseases. And the mill owners, in the speech, she talks about the mill owners were making 50 to 90% profit out of the mills, and the mine owners were making tremendous profits. So it was really one of these things where greed had taken over, and they were just using these people as merchandise, as chattel, and just grinding them out. If they died, that was fine. There was always another little person to take the place of a child worker when they died.
She also supported Eugene V. Debs, right?
Oh, she loved Eugene Debs, absolutely. In fact, when she was down in Atlanta, Georgia, she talked to the miners and railroad boys, and they were the ones that first told her about these little children working in the mills. And she said, it sounded like a modern-day Siberia. She thought that they were overdrawing the picture much, as she put it. And so she decided to go into the cotton mills, and the first thing she was asked by the man who ran the mills is, "Do you have children?" And she lied and said, "Yes, there's 6 of us." And he showed her a little shanty to live in, and then she went in Cottondale, Alabama. She went into the mills and saw the children. She was shocked. She was absolutely shocked that this was happening. And then she went over to Tuscaloosa, worked in a rope factory. She walked in, and again, it was run by child labor.
So when did child labor laws get passed in relation to Mother Jones?
That's a great question. This march, the March of the Mill Children that she did from Philadelphia to the door of Oyster Bay, Long Island in 1903, within 3 years, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey passed child labor laws that were enforced, underlined 12 times, that no child went into the mills before they were 14 years of age. Federal child labor laws in the United States were not passed until 1938.
Okay, so let's talk about this March of the Mill Children. As she goes from Philadelphia with how many kids?
She leaves Philadelphia with 300. I think once they hit the city line, they probably lose half of them. And she had asked the parents if she could have their children for a week or 10 days. Well, the march stretched over 3 weeks. She gets into Trenton, great Union town, they support her. But eventually there's an attrition rate. These children are very weak. They really can't make the march, even though the conductor on the interurban car gave them free rides for a lot of the way. I mean, basically it was too hard on the children. So it really dwindled down. So that by the time she marched into New York City, she probably had 30 people with her, men, women, and children.
And what happened in New York?
Oh, in New York, she gets to Hoboken. And she sends a committee over to speak with the chief of police, Epstein, asking for permission to march up 4th Avenue to Madison Square. Well, the chief of police, forbids their entrance to the city. So she's like, She goes over and speaks to Mayor Seth Lowe. The mayor's most courteous, but he says he'll have to support the police commissioner. So Mother Jones reminds the mayor that a piece of rotten royalty had come over not but last year, Prince Henry from Germany, and that the Congress of the United States had voted $45,000 to fill that fellow's stomach for 3 weeks, and that the officials of New York had entertained that chap, along with his brother, was making $4 million dividends out of the workers of the land. And so the mayor, and a Chinaman called Li Wu was also entertained. So she said, these children are the citizens of our nation. They create its wealth. They're not citizens. They don't create its wealth. So finally the mayor spoke to the chief of police, and they allowed the army in. They allowed the army, and they marched up 4th Avenue, accompanied, she says, by policemen, sergeants, roundsmen, and reserves from 3 precincts. So, and eventually she holds the meeting in 20th Street, where she shows them. The key thing was showing up with living children, the horrors of child labor. And once she did that to the citizenry, once they got out of these little pockets of mill towns, well, really people didn't know what was going on, and she showed them. The people rallied. The people rallied.
And so she went from New York to
New York.
The home
She
of Teddy Roosevelt?
she went to Coney Island after she had received a letter from. She says the president was from B.F. Barnes, the acting secretary for the president, saying that the president has the heartiest sympathy with every effort to prevent child labor, but it's really the state's issues, and so she continues to march on, and she gets to the door of Teddy Roosevelt's house on July 28th, and B.F. Barnes, the acting secretary for the president, meets her and says, the president needs his rest. He can't be bothered by matters which can be settled by us. If we allowed everyone to see him, he would have no time for himself. So she's like, okay, oh yes, of course. Well, the president has to go over on safari to Africa. He needs his rest to do that, to go chase the monkeys. And in this speech, and everything I say is Mother Jones's own words, which is Shakespearean, really. She uses, anytime Shakespeare writes a highly emotionalized passage, he uses a lot of repetition, alliteration, assonance, everything, and her speech is just rich with that. It's a very, wonderful verbal horse to ride. But basically, she said, if the Revolutionary Fathers could come back to earth, the first question they would ask is what has become of national pride. She said that, Roosevelt it's pronounced, had promised everything to labor. When we had our strike in Colorado, she reminds the people she's talking to, he sent 200 guns to blow our brains out. I don't forget, you do, but I don't. Our women were kicked out like dogs at the point of a bayonet. That is America. She goes on to say that some women in this country get up with $5 worth of paint on their faces and have toothbrushes for their dogs and say, oh, that horrible old woman, that horrible Mother Jones. So she said, I am horrible, I admit, and I want to be to you blood-sucking pirates.
Finally, Are you going to go to the home of Teddy Roosevelt?
I called Oyster Bay Historical Society. I called Oyster Bay Public Library. I talked to Charles at Sagamore Hill. He'll be hearing that probably. Maybe, no, he probably won't. He might not watch Democracy Now! But anyway, they all said no. I mean, she rips Teddy Roosevelt to shreds. She is furious with him. I mean, this is just not some, hobo off the street. She has gotten substantial press all the way from Philadelphia to Oyster Bay, the New York Times. I mean, she's been in Philadelphia Inquirer, she's gotten gorgeous publicity. So this is not just anyone coming
Newsday
forward.
did a very interesting piece, and they called the Sagamore Hill site, and they spoke to the spokesperson, Charles Marcus.
Yes, Charles.
And asked why you wouldn't be able to perform there on the centennial of Mother Jones's March of the Mill Children. He said, this is one of those minor footnotes of history.
Child labor, child slavery. A minor footnote. It's going on now. What's amazing about this, and what would have really been heroic about Oyster Bay, about Sagamore Hill really bringing Mother Jones in, is first of all they could have had a spokesperson there, somebody saying, what Teddy Roosevelt did do, what he did accomplish. He was involved with a lot of trust busting, a lot of environmental issues, and also, it's tragically current history. We're going to the global economy. 33 million jobs were just created in China. They have a horrible human rights abuse record. There's child labor happening all over the world right now, and in the United States of America still.
Betsy Means, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
And that does it for today's